Hey everybody, welcome to day 5 of our AP World History Modern review sessions. My name is Mason Logereau. I'm coming to you live from the Austin, Texas area, where for the last 2 days it was kind of nasty and rainy outside, but today the sun came out. And hey, when you're stuck at home and you can't go anywhere, it's kind of nice to have sun, so at least you can go for a walk around the neighborhood. All right, hey Logereau, what are we doing today? I'm glad you asked, very smart student who's watching this on YouTube. Today is going to be kind of a, let's take everything we've looked at over the last several sessions and put it all together. If you watched yesterday's session with Mr. Smith, he did a really good job of pointing out how the Cold War and decolonization were basically going on at the same time and definitely were affecting each other. So what I want to do today is kind of take a much broader look at the 20th century and ask the question of how did individuals and groups of people respond to the power structures, whether it be governments or economies, and to the changes in power structures in the 20th century. I also want to think about looking at visual primary sources, because my last couple of lessons, we've looked at a lot of written primary sources, but today I want to talk about how can we find point of view, purpose, situation, audience in those visual sources, because you will definitely be seeing some of those on this year's test, I think, depending on the new format, which we'll find out about later this week. But next year, if you take APUSH, you'll see the same thing. All right, so for our warm-up, Mr. Smith gave you a couple of questions here and a couple of documents. He gave you a claim, and then he asked you to do two things. One, underline or highlight the evidence from the document that proves that claim. And then two, in your own words, kind of describe why that evidence supports the claim. By the way, I just want to say one quick thing about this homework. I keep calling it homework in quotes, but these practice assignments. Make sure that you're talking to your teacher at school and let them know that you're doing this work. Because listen, every school's different. Everybody's doing their own thing. I get that. Some schools are requiring students to do work for grades. Some are not. Some may not be right now, but they may be later. If I were you, if you're doing these assignments at home, I would hold on to your work. Either keep it in a stack in your room, keep it online if you typed it up, somewhere in a Google Drive or something like that, but hold on to it and you can show your teacher later that you've been doing this work. Okay, so talk to your teacher about that, exactly what they want you to do, or if they want you to turn in this work that you're doing for these review sessions. All right, but anyway, let's look at our first one here. The claim that Smith gave for y'all was that even after those independence movements that he talked about yesterday, these brand new states, whether it be in Africa or Asia or elsewhere, were still maintaining ties to the former colonizers, former colonizing governments. And he talked about metropoles and things like that. So here we have a source, someone who was part of the Algerian National Liberation Front. So they're fighting for decolonization in Algeria from France, and later became the first prime minister of Algeria. And notice here in this document, and Smith highlighted it for y'all already, he talks about synthesis. He talks about synthesizing the Islamic world of North Africa and the Christian world of Europe and bringing them together to show that same connection that was still there even after decolonization. Now, you could also write this in your own words, something like what I have here, that he's demonstrating a desire to maintain a strong, positive relationship with the Christian or European world. Okay, so again, you should be able to find the evidence in the document, but you also need to be able to put it in your own words and explain exactly how it proves that claim. All right, the other source he gave you was again from another Algerian nationalist. And the claim was about nationalism, which Smith did a really good job of pointing out yesterday, that nationalism was a major, major cause of these decolonization movements. And it inspired a lot of people in these former colonies to try and fight for independence. Now, notice in this document, the term nationalism is never used. You don't see the word nationalism anywhere in here. But There are nationalist ideas. I mean, look at that very first sentence. It mentions religion. It mentions a fatherland, so we're talking about a geographic region, and it mentions a language. Now, nationalism is sometimes kind of a hard term to define or kind of a hard term to really nail down. But in almost every definition you'll ever see of nationalism, it almost always is going to mention religion, geographic area, and language. And you see that right there at the beginning. You also see here threats of violence between people that would try to divide the fatherland. So if you're looking to put this in your own words, he talks about the idea of nationalism across North Africa, again, region, language, religion, and even threats of violence against people that would try to divide North Africa, i.e. the French and other colonizers. All right, so let's get into what we need to know about for today. Oops, sorry about that. All right, what I did was here on the left side, I kind of gave you a list of major developments in the 20th century. We've talked about most of these already, although I know the two world wars, the Depression, we didn't cover a lot here in the review sessions, but I know you probably did cover them in class. We've talked about the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, or you did that in class as well. We talked about the rise of fascism and communism. We've definitely talked about the Cold War and decolonization. The one major development we have not talked about yet is globalization, but we are going to be doing that later this week. And really, globalization is a term you're probably familiar with because we're kind of living through it today. It's just the idea of the world coming together because of advancements in transportation and communication, that the world is a lot smaller today. People are more interconnected. That's all we're looking at with globalization. So you probably already understand that. But let's be honest. Let's look at this list here for a second. It's not a happy list, guys. There's a lot of really bad stuff that happened in the 20th century. And there were some major, major changes to political structures, economic structures. I mean, it was a century of change, no doubt about it. So today what I want to look at is how did individuals and groups around the world, how did they respond to all these changes and to the conflicts that occurred in the 20th century? One term you're probably familiar with is the term nonviolence. And so I want to take a look at that. And I especially want to look, of course, at the three major people you should think of when you think of the idea of nonviolence. That is Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. Those are the three main examples of nonviolence. You do need to know about all three men and what they were doing. All right. Smith did a really good job yesterday of talking about Gandhi and his importance and his role in the independence movement for India, when India was able to gain independence from Great Britain. And he also mentioned a little bit about Gandhi's use of nonviolence in order to do that. Remember, the idea behind nonviolence is that you find a law that is unjust. You purposefully break that law. You then accept the punishment that goes with it. And by doing that, you really shine a light on the injustice. And Gandhi did this in many different ways, through marches, through protests, through boycotts. And he's able to rally public pressure across India, but also in other parts of the world, to help India gain independence from Britain. Now, I want you to think about this idea of nonviolence in order to rally public sentiment. Remember that we're in the 20th century now. And in fact, all three of these guys we're going to look at are in the second half of the 20th century. It's a time of mass media. Radio is popular all over the world. When people go to the movie theater, they go to watch movies, yes, but before movies start, you didn't see all the previews and trailers like we see today. Oftentimes they saw newsreels. So we're talking about you see video from parts of the world and what's going on there. Television is starting to come around in some parts of the world in the kind of the 50s, 1960s. But the point is, with mass media, people are seeing images and video of the injustices that are happening around the world. And Gandhi's able to do that, to bring public pressure to bear on government officials. I don't know that this type of nonviolence would necessarily work in earlier time periods because you don't have that same mass media to get your message out. For example, Smith mentioned the Salt March that Gandhi did to protest the fact that the British authorities were only allowing people of India to buy salt from British merchants. Now, if we're being completely honest here, the SALT Act and having to buy salt from British merchants, that is not the worst thing the British were doing to the people of India. There were far worse things. But it's something that affected everybody. I mean, everybody needs salt to cook, right? Salt is really tasty and makes food good. And people can see the blatant injustice of it as well. It's easy to understand. It's easy to rally public pressure around. That's why Gandhi chose it. But the point is that Gandhi was able to successfully use nonviolence in order to gain independence for India from Britain. Later, we see other examples of nonviolence being used here in the United States and also in South Africa. I know that you're familiar with Martin Luther King. You know that in the 1950s and 60s, he was able to use the idea of nonviolence to bring about the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act here in the United States to help African Americans, especially in the South, in the 1960s. Nelson Mandela is probably someone you probably heard the name before, but you may not know his full story. And it really is an absolutely fascinating one. And I wish we had more time to go into it today. I really, really do, but we just don't because we have other things to cover. So what I've done is in the description of the video, right below me, there's a link to a video, and you might need to click the show more button to do it. But it's a video, it's an interview that Nelson Mandela did with Oprah Winfrey before he passed away several years ago. Please, please, please watch the video when you get a chance. It's about 7 or 8 minutes long. It won't take you very long. It's a really interesting interview. And before it starts, she does a really good kind of encapsulation of his life. But one of the things you have to know about South Africa, remember, South Africa actually gained its independence from Britain early on in the early 20th century, well before most countries in Africa who really didn't gain independence until, for most of them, after World War II. But when South Africa became a new country, it was run by a group known as the Afrikaners, white settlers who were a minority in the population, but who controlled the government, the military, the economy, and everything else, and instituted a policy of apartheid across South Africa. If you're not familiar with apartheid, you can kind of think of it as like segregation, Jim Crow laws we see in the United States after the Civil War, but much, much worse, okay, taken to a very much farther extreme. So policies of segregation across the country, you had certain neighborhoods for the white settlers, you had certain neighborhoods for the Black Africans of South Africa, and they never did meet. If you want a really interesting viewpoint on the policy of apartheid, do a little bit of research into Trevor Noah. He's a comedian and the host of The Daily Show. You've probably seen him before. He grew up in South Africa during this time of apartheid, but he has a very unique viewpoint of it because his dad was white, his mom was Black. And remember, this is a time when people of different races were not even allowed to socialize with each other, much less have a child together. And so his viewpoint is a very, very unique one. And I would definitely encourage you to look into his life more because it'll really teach you a little bit about apartheid and you'll learn a very unique viewpoint on it. But Mandela and his followers began trying to fight apartheid in the 1950s and 60s. And originally he called for nonviolence. But Mandela throughout his life really did struggle with, is nonviolence going to be effective? Because to be honest, at the beginning of his struggle, it simply was not. And there were often times when he considered calling for violent actions against the South African government. He was eventually arrested for the work that he was doing. He spent 28 years in prison, most of it in solitary confinement, most of it under a sentence of hard labor. But the amazing thing is, in the 1990s, apartheid finally came to an end. Some of the work because of what Mandela did, other parts because of international pressure on South Africa. But he eventually became Prime Minister of South Africa. Now, consider, as Prime Minister of South Africa, he is now in a position of power to seek revenge on all the people that jailed him for those 28 years. But instead, Mandela called for reconciliation across the country. And that was a very powerful moment there when he could have sought revenge, but instead sought reconciliation for the better of the country. And by the way, I absolutely love this quote from Nelson Mandela. I'm going to give you a second to read it, because I think it's a really beautiful quote. And it really speaks to a trap that I know I fall into sometimes, and other students do as well. When we start thinking about the great men and women of history, think about the Gandhis, the Mandelas, the Kings, all those people that we look up to. And a lot of times when we start to think about them, we treat them like heroes, which obviously, of course, they are. They did amazing things and sacrificed their lives in many cases, or their freedom. But then we almost start to treat them like more than human, like some sort of demigod. And we think to ourselves, yes, they did amazing things, but we could never do that ourselves. But what this Mandela quote really shows is that all of those heroes that we think about, no matter what time period we're talking about or what part of the world, they were humans just like us. They had the same struggles and fears that we all have. And so I absolutely love this quote. And I think when you consider that they were just humans just like us with the same struggles and same fears, it makes what they did even more impressive. So I absolutely love this quote. I wish you could take a little time later on after this video is over, go back, really read this carefully, and think about it and how it can apply to your own life. All right, I want to take a break real quick from the history story and talk about how do we analyze visuals, whether they be pictures, paintings, charts, graphs, whatever it might be. There's an exercise I like to do in my class known as optic, and you may have done it before in your class, or maybe you've done something similar. But what I really like about it is that it forces you to look at all the little details in the visual. But then it also forces you to take outside information, bring historical evidence to bear on the source, to do a little bit of analysis as well. So I'm going to show you right now real quick how you can do optic with the statue of Martin Luther King. And then I'm going to set you free to do one on your own here in a second. So when you do optic, the first thing you do is just an overview, a very brief description, less than a sentence. Here's what's in the picture. In the parts, you just simply list out everything that you see, big, small, everything. The title, I tell my students, think about the title you would give it. I usually don't put a title on these pictures if I'm having them do optic, but what title would you give to this picture? Or in this case, I want to take a specific look at this statue. Interrelationships. I want you to take some of the parts and how are they interacting with each other? What are they doing to each other? Did one cause the other? Is one affecting another? Is one maybe a continuity or a change of some sort? Let's talk about interrelationships between the parts. And then in the conclusion, that's when you start bringing historical information to bear. Bring me in some outside information, something that you can't see in the picture that's going to help you to better understand the picture. All right, so let's talk about this one. First off, this is a statue of Martin Luther King. You probably figured that out. It is on the campus of the University of Texas here in Austin, where I did go to school, my alma mater, so hook 'em. But this was a statue that I used to walk by almost every day when I was on campus going to class. And I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite pieces of art or statues anywhere on campus. But notice it's sort of a fairly simple statue, but there's a much deeper meaning in it that we need to consider. All right, so first off, the overview. Like I said, it's a statue of Martin Luther King. That's all it is for the overview. For the parts, yes, you have King. He is on a pedestal. If you notice down below on the pedestal here, there's engraving of a couple of small children. But notice what King is wearing. He's wearing a preacher's robe. Remember that Martin Luther King started out as a Christian minister. And you see that in this statue. And he has his arm outstretched as if he is preaching in a church. So there for the interrelationships, I did put King is speaking, because you can see the outstretched hand, and that he's wearing this preacher's robe. And the reason why I bring that up, because again, if we're going to bring in some outside information to bear, the reason why King practiced nonviolent ideas when it came to fighting the power structure in the American South was because of his Christian beliefs. His Christian beliefs informed his nonviolence. And by the way, it was the same thing for Gandhi in India. Gandhi was Hindu. His Hindu beliefs led to him practicing nonviolence. So notice here, I'm bringing in some outside information so that you can better understand why King did what he did or why Gandhi did what he did in India. All right, so I'm going to give you a chance to practice this. I'll give you a little bit of background on this picture. This is a picture of Nelson Mandela. He is in the jail cell that he lived in when he was in jail, that he was incarcerated in. This is after he got out, a couple of years after he got out, he returned to the jail cell. And that's what this picture is. So what I'd like for you to do is take about, I'm gonna give about 4 minutes or so. And I want you to just fill out this optic part on this picture. Now notice the first couple parts, those are pretty easy. You're just identifying things in the picture. But in that conclusion, I want you to bring in some outside information, something that you can't see in the picture, but something that would help better explain the picture. So I'm gonna give you about 3 or 4 minutes to do that. Y'all ready? Go. All right, take a couple more minutes here. At this point, you should probably have the overview and parts done. Like I said, that's kind of the easy part. But now you're getting to the little bit tougher part, the interrelationships, and especially the conclusion. All right, take about 1 more minute. Again, I really want you to focus on that conclusion and bringing in some outside information. You don't necessarily need to make a historical claim because I really didn't give you a question to make a claim about. But again, bring in some outside information that would help you to better understand this picture and this moment here. All right. So again, let's talk about some possible answers. Again, as always, if yours are different than mine, that is totally okay. But talk to your teacher if you want to get some more individualized feedback. Okay, very simply, overview. It is Nelson Mandela in a jail cell. That's it. The parts, you've got Mandela himself, you've got the jail cell, you have bars over the window like you would see in a jail cell. For those interrelationships though, start thinking about what Mandela is doing, how he's staring out the window, looking through those bars on the window. And then for my conclusion, this is when I start to bring in information about Mandela. The fact that he spent 28 years, most of them in this cell right here. And you can just imagine what's going through his mind in this moment, how he's reflecting on his time there, but also again, on those ideas of nonviolence and of reconciliation, when a lot of us would be tempted to get revenge and violence on those that placed us here. So again, you bring in that outside information to better understand the source. Okay, let's get back to the history part of this. Obviously, nonviolence was an extremely important movement in the 20th century, in India, in South Africa, in the United States, and by the way, in other parts of the world also. I found, and I wish I could have had time to share with y'all, this fantastic poem by a French soldier who was trying to, who didn't want to fight in Vietnam. Because remember, as we talked about the other day, as Mr. Smith talked about, Vietnam is actually a French colony. The French were in there fighting before the United States. And he, in this poem, this French soldier was laying out the reasons why he did not want to go fight in Vietnam. And we see this in many other countries as well, this idea of nonviolence. But again, if we're thinking about reactions that people had to power structures of the 20th century, nonviolence is not the only one. Obviously, terrorism and violence were also a big part of the 20th century. So we see a couple examples here. One in this picture, the Irish Republican Army in Ireland, who saw Ireland being what they considered occupied by the British. And they kind of realized, or they thought that the only way to stop British occupation was through violence. Or if you think about Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, who saw Western occupation of traditional Muslim holy lands. For example, when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s, or in the early 1990s, when the United States was using Saudi Arabia for military bases to fight in the first Gulf War against Iraq. So in these cases, you see groups using terrorism and violence for political means in order to fight the political structure. You also, in many parts of the world, start to see women taking on a much bigger role in political processes, whether it be through suffrage, through voting in the ballot box, or through direct protest, or in some cases, both. This is a picture on the right of Alice Paul and some of her group that were protesting in front of the White House for a passage to a constitutional amendment, which eventually becomes the 19th Amendment, allowing women to vote here in the United States. By the way, if you don't know the story of Alice Paul, please, please, please go look it up and do some more research on her. Fascinating woman who's leading these protests during World War I in front of the White House, which took a lot of guts and courage to fight for that and eventually got the 19th Amendment passed. Okay, one more thing I want to do today. I've got here 2 pictures. These are from a DBQ from a couple years ago that was on the AP test. The question for the DBQ that year was about the role of women in politics in Latin America in the 20th century. So I'd like for you to do, you're gonna do a couple things. I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes or so. The first thing is you're gonna make a historical claim. So again, sort of a mini thesis statement. What can you tell about the role of women in politics in Latin America in the 20th century based on these 2 pictures? And then let's talk about the document's purpose, point of view, situation, or audience. Because we've done this for written sources. And a lot of times students kind of have this trouble of thinking about the purpose or point of view of a photograph. But take a second, make your claim, and then think about purpose, point of view, situation, and audience. And you might want to kind of look back to Optic and do some of that. I'm not saying that you have to do every single step in it when it comes to an essay like a DBQ, but it might help you to go through those steps in your head, look at all the little parts of it, bring in some outside information as well. Okay, but try and come up with at least one example of purpose, point of view, situation, or audience for each of the documents. So I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes to do that. Y'all ready? Go. All right, take about 4 more minutes. At this point, you should be able to come up with a claim at least and write that down. Again, one sentence should be enough for that claim about women's role in politics in Latin America in the 20th century. And now start to think about purpose, point of view, situation, or audience. And as always, when you're thinking about sourcing, make sure you read the source line of any DBQ. I promise it's going to help you. Even in this case, if you don't know a lot about the Mexican Revolution or about what happened in Argentina in the 80s, you can still use that sourcing to kind of help you and piece it together. If you're not sure about what happened in Argentina, remember we did talk about Chile the other day. And it was a very similar situation, Argentina and Chile, if that helps you. All right, take about 1 more minute. Again, make sure you got a good solid claim using these two documents. Make sure you got at least one idea of purpose, point of view, situation, or audience for each of the documents. 2 would be great if you can. And I always tell students when it comes to the AP test, remember, you don't lose points for doing something wrong. You only get points for doing something right. So if you attempt something twice in an essay, like a thesis, if you write your thesis in the intro and the conclusion, as long as one of them's right, you get the point for that. So keep that in mind. All right, so let's come back together here. Possible claims you can make. Okay, 1, I kept it kind of simple here. I just said women took a role in Latin American politics through direct action and through protest. Probably a better way maybe to claim took a more important role in Latin American politics, some kind of adjective there to describe the role, probably better, but something like this could certainly work. Now, as far as the sourcing goes, like I was saying earlier, a lot of times when we look at a written source, point of view or purpose is usually kind of easy to figure out. It's tougher in visual sources. So let's look at this first document of these women. They're soldiers in the Mexican Revolution. So remember, during the Mexican Revolution in the 19 teens, a lot of farmers and poor people in Mexico were fighting for a more democratic form of government. And you see here, this is a staged photo. So the photographer wanted all the women to hold their rifles, and notice they're all aiming them. But if you think about the purpose, it really is to show that women are a huge part of this fight in the Mexican Revolution. And you can see that through the fact that they're all holding guns, that they all know how to use them, and that they're willing to use them as well, as you can tell from this document. So you can still see the purpose of the photographer. It's not just a picture of women standing there holding guns. They are holding those guns and they are aiming them and they are ready to use them to fight in this revolution. Oops. For the second one, all right, notice here we have a group of mothers, and you can see that in the sourcing line, who are looking for information on the disappearance of their children. Remember I talked about this in Chile the other day, that a lot of people who oppose the government just simply disappeared. Somewhere in the thousands of people, no trial, nothing was told about them. They just simply disappeared. They were probably killed and executed, but no one really knows. Something similar was happening in Argentina. Consider for a second kind of that traditional female role in many societies where women are expected to sort of take care of the family. Here we have an example of women who are taking care of their family, but they're doing it now in the public sphere. Usually when you think of taking care of the family, you think of it at home in the private sphere. But now women are expanding their role and doing it in the public sphere and taking more of a role in political life through direct protest of the government. So again, that kind of information that you bring to bear can help with the sourcing of a visual source if you come across something like that in an essay or a short answer question. All right, so quick debrief of what we've done today. Again, the question was really about overall, how did people respond to political, economic, military power structures around the world in the 20th century? We talked a lot about nonviolence. Again, you've got to know about Gandhi, King, and Mandela, but there are other examples out there as well. So make sure you know maybe some of those other smaller examples. And then we also looked a lot about visual sources. Again, I think the optic method, if you're taking a test, if it's timed, you probably don't have time to go through every single step. But at least make sure you're following that optic method by looking at all the little details in the picture, or if it's a chart or graph or whatever it might be, And then most importantly, make sure you're bringing in outside historical evidence. It's never enough just to talk about everything in the picture. I mean, let's be honest. I could show the picture to a little kid and he could say, yeah, it's a bunch of women holding guns. That doesn't tell us much. You've got to be able to do that and bring in outside historical evidence. All right, so here's your practice for tonight. Like I said, if you've been doing these at home, great job. Keep up the good work. It's only going to help you for that AP test in May. But like I said, make sure you're talking to your teacher because this could also show that you're doing work at home. It could help your grade depending on the situation at your school. All right, so this is actually a short answer question from the AP test from a couple of years ago. This is more about governments and violence and mass violence. But again, I think it's an important question to ask when thinking about political and military structures in the 20th century. So there's 3 parts to it. I'm going to leave it here on the screen for a second. You don't need to answer it right away. You can stop the video now, come back to this later, but just make sure you've done it before tomorrow's lesson with Mr. Smith because he's going to go over it with y'all first thing on tomorrow. All right. So thank y'all so much. I really appreciate you spending time here. It's only going to help you for that AP test. It's coming up in May. You're going to do great. If you need any help with any of this, if you need to better understanding the topics, please, please, please reach out to your history teachers. They want to hear from you, okay? They're stuck at home just like you are right now. Please talk to them. They want to hear from you. All right, y'all have a good evening. Mr. Smith will be with y'all tomorrow, and I will see you again on Thursday. Take care.